Claire's day had started like any other. The mid-morning sun cast a golden glow over the bustling city streets, and the rhythmic hum of traffic provided a familiar soundtrack to her walk home from the library. Her headphones were tucked into her ears, but no music played. It was a trick she had learned from her father, a way to appear unassuming while staying hyper-aware of her surroundings. Claire wasn't an ordinary 17-year-old. She had grown up under the watchful eye of a father who once worked in intelligence, a man who taught her how to spot surveillance, lose a tail, and think 3 steps ahead. For Claire, this wasn't paranoia. It was survival. It was at the corner of 8th and Pine that she first noticed him. At first, it was just a flicker in her peripheral vision. A man dressed in black, standing casually near the entrance of a cafe. He held a phone in his hand, pretending to scroll. Nothing unusual, Claire thought. But as she crossed the street, her instincts tugged at her. He moved too, keeping pace, his eyes flicking toward her when he thought she wasn't looking. Claire's heart quickened, but her face remained neutral. She had learned long ago how to mask fear. By the time she reached the corner deli, she was sure he was following her. Instead of panicking, Claire acted as though she hadn't noticed. She ducked into the deli, letting the doorbell chime behind her. The warm smell of fresh bread filled the air as she pretended to browse the sandwich counter. Through the reflection in the glass display, she saw him stop outside. His face was partially obscured by sunglasses. He didn't enter, but lingered by the window, pretending to check his phone. Amateur, Claire thought, though her pulse was pounding in her ears. She had seen her father's line of work up close. Real professionals were invisible, their presence a ghostly whisper. This man, with his conspicuous surveillance and overly casual demeanor, was either inexperienced or deliberately trying to make her nervous. Claire grabbed a bottle of water from the counter, paid for it, and left the deli. As she stepped back into the sunlight, her eyes scanned for reflective surfaces. There, a car window across the street gave her a clear view of him, following at a steady pace. He was keeping his distance, but not enough to fool her. She decided to test him. Turning abruptly, Claire headed into the nearest department store. It was large, crowded, and full of escape routes. She weaved through the racks of clothing, taking sharp turns and doubling back, pretending to inspect a scarf display. After 10 minutes, she slipped behind a mannequin and waited. Sure enough, the man in black entered. His gaze scanned the store, and he looked agitated, as though he realized he was losing her trail. Claire's instincts screamed at her to run, but her curiosity was stronger. Who was this guy? Why was he following her? And more importantly, what did he want? She had no answers, but she wasn't going to let fear control her. Instead, she decided to flip the script. Claire exited through the side door, blending into the crowd outside. She glanced over her shoulder, but the man in black was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, she felt a flicker of relief. But as she turned the corner, she froze. There he was, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, waiting for her. His sunglasses were gone now, revealing piercing blue eyes that locked onto hers. Claire's breath hitched, but she stood her ground. "Claire," he said, his voice low and steady, "we need to talk." She didn't respond, her mind racing. How did he know her name? What did he want from her? The man took a step closer, and Claire instinctively took a step back. "Your father sent me," he said, his tone softening. "He's in trouble, Claire, and you're the only one who can help him." Claire's heart sank. Her father had been distant lately, but she never imagined he was in danger. The man in black reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable. "Take it," he said, "but be careful. There are others watching, and they're not as friendly as I am." Claire hesitated, then snatched the paper from his hand. She unfolded it quickly, her eyes scanning the words written in her father's familiar handwriting. "Trust no one. Find the key. It's the only way to stop them." Before she could ask any questions, the man in black turned and disappeared. into the crowd, leaving Claire standing alone on the sidewalk, her mind swirling with questions and fear. She didn't know what her father had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: her life was about to change forever. Claire stepped out from behind the crates, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the alley. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, her tone calm but firm. The man froze for a split second, his confident facade cracking as surprise flickered across his face. But he recovered quickly, a smirk curling his lips. "I think you're mistaken," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I wasn't following you." Claire crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Really? Because you've been behind me for 3 blocks. I've seen your face in every reflective surface I passed. You're not very good at this, are you?" The man's smirk faded, replaced by something colder. "Go home, kid. You don't want to get involved in this." "Too late," Claire shot back, her heart thundering in her chest. She felt the weight of her phone in her pocket, her finger brushing against the emergency dial button. "I'm already involved. Who are you, and what do you want from me?" For a moment, the man didn't answer. His jaw tightened and his hand twitched toward his jacket pocket. Claire took a step back, her muscles tensing. But instead of pulling out a weapon, he retrieved a small, sleek device. He tapped it once, and a faint buzz filled the air. Claire's phone screen flickered. The emergency dial she had been ready to press disappearing. "What?" she began, but the man cut her off. "Listen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're in over your head. I'm not the one you should be afraid of." "Then who should I be afraid of?" Claire demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. She hated the vulnerability creeping into her tone, but she couldn't help it. The man's demeanor had shifted. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was almost protective. "People who don't care whether you live or die," he replied. "People who will come after you for something you don't even know you have." Claire's breath hitched. "What are you talking about? What do I have?" The man shook his head, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "I don't have time to explain. Just stay out of sight and don't trust anyone." Before Claire could respond, he turned and walked away, his black coat billowing behind him. She stood frozen in the alley, her mind racing. Who was he? What was he trying to warn her about? And most importantly, what had she just gotten herself into? As the distant sound of the city's bustle returned to her ears, Claire clenched her fists. She didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore this. Her father's training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every fibre of her being was screaming that something was very wrong. Claire pulled out her phone, but the screen remained blank, unresponsive. The man's device had disabled it completely. She cursed under her breath and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to get them standing in an alley. She stepped out onto the street, blending into the crowd. Her eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of the man in black or anyone else who might be watching her. The city felt different now, every passerby a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place for danger. Claire's mind raced as she tried to piece together what little she knew. The man had mentioned something she didn't even know she had. What could it be? And why would anyone come after her for it? As she walked, Claire's thoughts turned to her father. He had always been secretive, his past shrouded in mystery. She had never questioned it before, but now doubts began to creep in. What had he been involved in? And how much danger was she really in? Claire's steps quickened as she made her way to the one place she felt safe, her father's old study. It was a small, cluttered room in their apartment, filled with books, maps, and gadgets from his days in intelligence. If there were answers to be found, they would be there. When she reached the apartment, she hesitated at the door. The man's warning echoed in her mind. Don't trust anyone. But she had no choice. She needed to know the truth. Claire unlocked the door and stepped inside, her heart pounding. The study was just as she remembered it. dusty and untouched since her father's last visit. She began searching through the drawers and shelves, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. It wasn't long before she found a small, locked box hidden beneath a stack of old files. Claire's hands trembled as she picked it up. Whatever was inside, it had to be important. She took a deep breath and began to work on the lock. Her father had taught her how to pick 1 year ago, and the skill came back to her quickly. With a soft click, the box opened. Inside was a single USB drive and a note in her father's handwriting. "If you're reading this, Claire, it means I'm not there to protect you. Trust no one. The key is everything." Claire stared at the note, her mind reeling. The key? What key? And what was on the USB drive? She didn't have time to think. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside snapped her back to reality. Someone was coming. She grabbed the USB drive and stuffed it into her pocket, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, and Claire knew she had to move. She slipped out of the study and into the kitchen, her eyes darting around for an escape route. The front door was too risky. Whoever was out there might be waiting for her. Instead, she opened the window and climbed out onto the fire escape, her movements quick and silent. As she descended the stairs, Claire's mind was a whirlwind of questions and fear. But one thing was certain. She was no longer just a girl walking home from the library. She was now at the center of something much bigger, something dangerous, and she had no choice but to see it through. Claire wasn't about to let someone else dictate her life. If the man in black thought he could scare her into hiding, he had another thing coming. She wasn't running. Not yet. Not until she had answers. And if he thought he had the upper hand, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The morning's encounter with the man in black lingered in Claire's mind like a shadow. His cryptic warning, his ability to disable her phone, and his strange behavior. It all felt like the opening notes of a much larger, more dangerous symphony. But Claire wasn't about to sit back and wait for the music to swell. She was going to take control of the situation. After leaving the alley, Claire didn't go home. Instead, she decided to move through some of her usual routes, testing whether the man would reappear. She knew she was taking a risk, but she also knew she couldn't ignore what had just happened. If there was someone else, someone more dangerous, coming after her, she needed to know who and why. By late afternoon, the sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Claire walked with a purposefully casual stride. Her phone was still glitching from whatever the man had done to it, so she relied on the skills her father had taught her. Stay aware of your surroundings, use reflective surfaces to check for a tail, and never let fear cloud your judgment. She turned into a small park, the kind with old benches and towering oaks that stretched their limbs across the sky. Families played in the open fields, children squealing with laughter as they chased each other. It was the perfect place to blend in, and the perfect place to lure someone out of hiding. Claire didn't have to wait long. Sitting on a bench near the edge of the park, she pretended to read a book, though her eyes remained fixed on her surroundings. She saw him again, the man in black. This time, he was leaning against a lamppost, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. He wasn't trying to blend in anymore. If anything, his stance was almost challenging. He wants me to know he's here, Claire thought, her grip tightening on the book. She had to admit, it was unnerving, the way he carried himself, the way he seemed completely unbothered by her noticing him. It wasn't the behavior of someone trying to avoid being caught. It was the behavior of someone confident, someone who believed they had the upper hand. But Claire wasn't about to let him have it. Standing abruptly, she tucked the book under her arm and started walking again. She didn't glance in his direction, though her pulse quickened as she caught a glimpse of him falling into step a short distance behind her. Claire's mind raced. He's not hiding. That means he either wants me to confront him again, or he's waiting for me to lead him somewhere. Either way, I'm going to use this. She headed for the heart of downtown, where the streets were alive with the evening rush. Crowds of commuters streamed in every direction, their faces buried in phones or illuminated by the glow of screens in shop windows. Claire navigated the throng with practiced ease, occasionally stopping to check her phone or window shop, always keeping an eye on her reflection to track the man in black's movements. He followed, his presence a steady weight behind her. He never got too close, but he never fell too far behind either. It was a careful, calculated pursuit, and Claire found herself both impressed and annoyed by his persistence. Her plan began to take shape. She slipped into a high-end department store, the kind with glossy floors and towering racks of clothes. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, and the hum of chatter filled the space. Claire moved quickly, weaving through the aisles and doubling back, using the store's layout to her advantage. She glanced at a mirrored column and saw the man in black enter the store, his eyes scanning the area. He was good, but Claire was better. She ducked into a changing room, closing the curtain behind her. Her heart pounded as she pulled out the USB drive she had found in her father's study. She didn't have a laptop, but she knew the store had a tech section. If she could access a computer, she might finally get some answers. Claire waited a few moments, then peeked out of the changing room. The man in black was still searching for her, his movements growing more urgent. She slipped out and made her way to the tech section, where rows of laptops and tablets were on display. She grabbed one, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she inserted the USB drive. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single folder labeled Project Blacklight. Claire's breath hitched as she opened it. Inside were files, dozens of them, filled with names, dates, and locations. She didn't have time to read everything, but one name stood out: her father's. Before she could process what she was seeing, a hand slammed down on the laptop, closing it with a sharp click. Claire looked up to see the man in black standing over her, his expression unreadable. "I told you to stay out of sight," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're playing a dangerous game, Claire." She stood her ground, her eyes blazing. "And I told you I'm not running, not until I know the truth. What is Project Blacklight? And why is my father's name in these files?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. If they find out you have that drive, they'll come for you. And they won't stop until they get what they want." Claire's mind raced. Who are they, and what do they want? Before he could answer, the sound of raised voices echoed through the store. Claire turned to see two security guards approaching, their eyes fixed on her and the man in black. The man cursed under his breath and grabbed Claire's arm. "We need to go. Now." Claire didn't argue. She yanked the USB drive from the laptop and followed him as he led her through the store, weaving through aisles and dodging displays. The guards shouted after them, but the man in black moved with a precision that left them in the dust. They burst out of the store and into the crowded street, the cool evening air hitting Claire's face. The man didn't slow down, pulling her into a nearby alley. When they were finally out of sight, he turned to her, his expression grim. "You're in deeper than you realize," he said. "But if you want to survive, you're going to have to trust me." Claire stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of questions and fear. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. She was no longer just a girl trying to uncover the truth. She was now a player in a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than she ever imagined. The department store smelled faintly of expensive perfume, and the murmur of shoppers filled the space. Claire weaved through the racks, using the mirrors on the walls to track the man in black as he entered the store. He didn't follow her directly, but lingered near the entrance, pretending to browse a display of watches. Claire's lips curved into a slight smile. "He's trying to be subtle. Too bad for him. I'm better at this game." She made her way to the escalator, glancing over her shoulder just long enough to see him abandon the watch display and move toward the same escalator. Her heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. She wasn't just going to lose him, she was going to trap him. At the top of the escalator, she turned sharply into the women's section and ducked behind a row of mannequins. Her hiding spot gave her a clear view of the escalator, and she crouched low, waiting. Seconds later, The man appeared, his eyes scanning the area. He hesitated, clearly uncertain where she had gone. Claire's phone buzzed faintly in her pocket, a reminder of its uselessness, but she didn't need it. She already had a plan for what came next. Moving quickly but quietly, she circled around the racks and emerged behind him. "Lose something?" she asked, her voice steady. The man spun, around, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "You're persistent," he said, his tone almost begrudgingly respectful, "but you don't understand what you're getting yourself into." "Then why don't you explain it to me?" Claire shot back. "Who are you and why are you following me?" For a moment, the man didn't answer. His jaw tightened and his eyes darted around the store as though checking for eavesdroppers. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You're being watched by people who don't care about playing fair. I'm the least of your worries." Claire folded her arms, her frustration mounting. "You keep saying things like that, but you're not giving me anything concrete. Who are these people and what do they want from me?" "I don't have time to explain," he said, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "Just know that whatever you're caught up in, it's bigger than you think. Go home, stay out of sight, and—" "Let me guess," Claire interrupted, her sarcasm cutting through the tension. "Don't trust anyone." His expression darkened. "Exactly." Claire took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "That's not good enough. You've been following me all day. If you're so concerned about my safety, start talking. Otherwise, I'll assume you're one of the bad guys." The man hesitated, and for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was brief, but it was enough. He wasn't as invulnerable as he seemed. Before he could respond, the store's intercom crackled to life, announcing its imminent closure. Shoppers began making their way toward the exits, their footsteps echoing in the quieting space. The man glanced toward the doors, then back at Claire. "Go home," he said again, his voice softer but no less urgent. "Please." Without waiting for her response, he turned and disappeared into the thinning crowd. Claire stood there for a moment, her mind racing. She didn't know what to make of him, his warnings, his cryptic advice, his sudden vulnerability. But one thing was clear, she couldn't let this go. Not now. She followed him out of the store, keeping her distance as he moved through the crowded streets. The city was alive with the glow of neon signs and the hum of evening traffic. Claire stayed close, using the reflections in windows and car mirrors to track him. He was heading toward the river, where the streets grew quieter and the shadows deeper. When he turned into a narrow alley, Claire hesitated. This was risky, she knew that, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. She crept forward, her footsteps silent on the pavement. The alley was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. She saw him standing there, his back to her, as if waiting. "I know you're there," he said without turning around. "You're not as stealthy as you think." Claire stepped out of the shadows, her arms crossed. "Then why did you lead me here?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Because you're not going to stop, are you? No matter what I say, you're going to keep digging." "You're right," Claire said. "So why not just tell me the truth?" The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The truth is complicated and dangerous. But if you're determined to get yourself killed, I might as well give you a fighting chance." Claire's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Start talking." He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Your father wasn't just an intelligence officer. He was part of something bigger, a project called Blacklight. It was supposed to be a way to track and neutralize threats before they happened. But it went wrong. The people running it, they started using it for their own gain. Your father found out, and he tried to stop them. That's why he disappeared." Claire's breath hitched. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" The man's expression softened, just for a moment. "He's alive, Claire, but he's in hiding. And now they think you have something Something your father left behind. That's why they're after you. Claire's mind raced. The USB drive. It had to be what he was talking about. What's on it? She asked. I don't know, he admitted. But it's enough to bring down some very powerful people, and they'll do anything to get it back. Before Claire could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alley. The man's eyes widened, and he grabbed her arm. We need to go. Now! Claire didn't argue. She followed him as he led her through the maze of alleys, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. Her heart pounded as they burst out onto a deserted street, the river glinting in the moonlight ahead. Who's following us? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled her into the shadows, his grip tightening. Stay close, he said, and whatever you do, don't let them catch you. Claire nodded, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She didn't know who to trust or what was coming next. But one thing was certain. She was done running. Whatever this was, she was going to see it through. The man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Claire stood there, her thoughts swirling. The encounter had left her with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Whoever this man was, he wasn't going to stop. And if he thought she was just going to do as she was told, he didn't know her at all. As she left the store and stepped into the cool evening air, Claire made a silent vow. The next time she saw him, she would be ready. And this time, she would be the one asking the questions and getting the answers. The next morning, Claire sat at her desk, staring out of the window at the quiet street below. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind, each detail sharpening her resolve. She didn't know who the man in black was, but she wasn't going to let him keep her in the dark. If he wanted to follow her, fine. She'd make him follow her exactly where she wanted him to go. Pulling a map of the city from her desk drawer, Claire began planning her route. She chose familiar places, crowded locations where she could observe him without being too exposed. Then, she pinpointed her destination, a disused alley tucked behind a small, forgotten bookstore. It was the perfect place to corner him. Claire checked her backpack, making sure everything was ready. She didn't carry much, just essentials, a pocket flashlight, her phone, still glitching from the previous encounter, and a small canister of pepper spray her father had insisted she carry. If things went wrong, she wanted to be prepared. By the time she stepped out of her house, the mid-morning sun was already high in the sky. Claire adjusted the straps of her backpack and set off, her steps measured and deliberate. The day seemed calm, but her every nerve was on edge. She was certain he'd find her again. It didn't take long. Claire caught sight of him as she exited a coffee shop. His dark coat blended into the bustle of the sidewalk. He was standing across the street, partially concealed by a bus stop shelter. His posture was casual, but she noticed how his eyes tracked her movement. You're making this too easy, Claire thought, fighting the urge to smirk. She began to walk, keeping her pace steady as she led him through the city. First, she took him through the outdoor market, weaving between vendors and shoppers. She stopped occasionally to inspect a stall, using the reflections in shiny surfaces to keep tabs on him. He followed at a distance, never too close but always there. Next, she led him through a busy pedestrian square where street performers and tourists created a chaotic but perfect cover. Claire moved with purpose, her eyes scanning for the next turn, the next opportunity to test him. She could feel his presence like a shadow, always just out of reach but never far behind. Finally, she reached the narrow street that led to the alley. The bookstore was small and unassuming, its windows dusty and its sign faded. Claire slowed her pace, pretending to browse the display in the window. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him pause at the corner, his gaze fixed on her. This is It, she thought. Time to see if he'll take the bait. She turned and walked into the alley, her footsteps echoing against the brick walls. The air was cool and damp, and the sounds of the city faded into a distant hum. Claire stopped halfway down the alley, her back to the entrance. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest. Seconds later, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. He was here. You're persistent, the man's voice echoed through the alley. I'll give you that. Claire turned to face him, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. And you're predictable. I knew you'd follow me. The man stepped closer, his hands in his coat pockets. You're playing a dangerous game. Claire, I told you to stay out of this. And I told you I'm not going to sit back and wait for answers. She shot back. Who are you? And what do you want from me? For a moment he didn't answer. His eyes scanned the alley, as if checking for something, or someone. Then he sighed. You're not going to let this go, are you? Not a chance, Claire said, her voice firm. The man hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but we can't talk here. It's not safe. Claire crossed her arms. Then where? He glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. There's a place, quiet, out of the way. But you're going to have to trust me. Claire raised an eyebrow. Trust you? After everything? You don't have to trust me, he said. But if you want answers, you don't have a choice. Claire studied him for a moment, weighing her options. She didn't trust him, not completely, but she also knew she couldn't keep running in circles. Finally, she nodded. Lead the way. The man turned and started walking, and Claire followed, her senses on high alert. She didn't know where they were going or what she was walking into, but one thing was certain. She was done being in the dark. Whatever this was, she was going to see it through, no matter the cost. Claire led the man in black through the city, her steps deliberate and calculated. She started at the outdoor market, weaving through the bustling crowd of vendors and shoppers. She stopped occasionally to inspect items, using the reflections in glass cases to keep an eye on him. He hovered at the edge of the crowd, his dark coat making him stand out despite his attempts to blend in. Claire noticed how his movements were more tense today, less casual. Good, she thought. Stay on edge. Next, she entered a library, the kind with tall, dusty shelves that created natural hiding spots. Claire lingered there longer, running her fingers along the spines of books, while watching him try to maintain line of sight. He seemed more agitated, his eyes darting around as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. Claire used the library's maze-like layout to her advantage, doubling back and disappearing into the stacks, before reappearing just as he thought he'd lost her. When she left the library, she took a series of deliberate turns through the quieter parts of town. Fewer people meant fewer distractions, and it also meant she could confirm he was still following her. By the time she reached the bookstore, her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of control. The bookstore was old and dimly lit, with narrow aisles and shelves packed so tightly they seemed to sag under the weight of their contents. The shopkeeper, a grey-haired woman with reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, barely looked up as Claire entered. Back in a minute, Claire said softly, not waiting for a response as she slipped through the store and into the alley behind it. The alley was as she remembered, narrow, with walls of exposed brick and an old fire escape ladder hanging from above. Claire's shoes scuffed softly against the pavement as she positioned herself at the far end, her eyes fixed on the door she'd come through. The moments stretched long, each second feeling like an eternity as she waited for him to take the bait. Would he follow her all the way, or would he sense the trap and back off? Then the door creaked open. The man in black stepped into the alley, his movements cautious but deliberate. He stopped just a few steps from the door, his gaze sweeping the space before landing on Claire. His dark coat billowed slightly in the breeze, and his face remained unreadable behind his sunglasses. You're persistent, Claire said, her voice steady despite the tight knot in her chest. "I could say the same about you," he replied, his tone calm but edged with curiosity. "You've been leading me on quite the chase." Claire crossed her arms, planting her feet firmly. "Why are you following me?" For a moment he said nothing. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent battle of wills. Then he took a slow step forward. "It's not safe for you," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "You've drawn the attention of people who don't care about playing fair." Claire's jaw tightened. "You keep saying that, but you're not telling me who these people are or what they want." "Because I don't have all the answers yet," he admitted, surprising her with his honesty. "But I know enough to tell you this. You're in over your head, and if you keep pushing, you're going to get yourself and others hurt." Claire took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Then give me something. Anything. Who are you? Why are you so invested in this?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "My name is Marcus, and I'm not your enemy, Claire. I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "From who?" Marcus glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for eavesdroppers. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "From the people who killed your father." Claire's breath hitched. "What are you talking about? My father's alive. He's in hiding." Marcus shook his head, his expression grim. "No, Claire. He's gone. And if you don't listen to me, you're next." Claire's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was lying, but something in his voice, something raw and genuine, stopped her. "Prove it," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Prove he's gone." Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded photograph. He handed it to her, his eyes never leaving hers. Claire unfolded it with shaking hands. The photo showed her father, his face pale and drawn, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. But it was the date stamped in the corner that made her stomach drop. 2 weeks ago. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's the last known photo of him," Marcus said quietly. "He was trying to expose Project Blacklight. They found him before he could." Claire's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was staring her in the face. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're the only one who can finish what he started," Marcus said. "But you can't do it alone. And if you keep running around like this, you're going to get yourself killed." Claire stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she also knew she couldn't keep going like this, blind and alone. "What do you want me to do?" she asked finally. Marcus stepped closer, his expression softening. "Come with me. Let me show you the truth. And then we'll figure out what to do next." Claire hesitated, her instincts warring with her desperation for answers. Finally she nodded. "Fine, but if you're lying to me—" "I'm not," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "But you're going to have to trust me." Claire took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she was walking into, but one thing was certain. She was done running. Whatever this was, she was going to see it through, no matter the cost. The man in black's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "You're more connected to this than you realize," he said, his voice softening as he took another step closer. "And if you don't trust me, you're going to find out the hard way." Claire's mind raced. Connected? What was he talking about? She wanted to press him, to demand answers, but the way he spoke, calm, certain, made her hesitate. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was trying to warn her. Before she could respond, a sound broke the tension. The faint shuffle of footsteps echoed from the far end of the alley. Both Claire and the man in black turned sharply, their bodies tensing. A figure stepped into view. A second man, dressed similarly in dark clothes, but with a rougher demeanor. His eyes flicked between Claire and her pursuer, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Looks like I found you first," the newcomer said, his voice dripping with mockery. The man in black shifted slightly, positioning himself between Claire and Hori, the newcomer. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone colder than Claire had heard before. The second man ignored him, his gaze settling on Claire. "You've been causing quite a stir, haven't you? Didn't think a kid like you would be so hard to catch." Claire's heart pounded as she realized the newcomer wasn't here for the man in black. He was here for her, and whatever game she thought she was playing had just escalated. "Stay back," the man in black warned, his voice sharp now. The newcomer chuckled. "What are you going to do, hero? You're outnumbered." Claire's breath caught. The man in black turned his head slightly, just enough to murmur under his breath, "Run," but Claire didn't move. Her feet were rooted to the ground, her mind racing with a single defiant thought, "I'm not running anymore." The alley felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter as the tension reached a breaking point. Claire clenched her fists, her instincts screaming at her to fight. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone decide her next move for her. The alley felt alive with tension, the walls echoing every sound, the faint shuffle of shoes, the soft breaths, the rustling of discarded papers. The man in black was still positioned in front of her, his posture rigid, his gaze locked on the newcomer. For a moment, no one moved. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears as she assessed the situation. The newcomer took a step forward, his smirk widening. "Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you walk away." The man in black didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Claire could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched. At his sides. He was preparing for a fight. Claire's mind raced. She didn't know who this newcomer was, or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. He wasn't here to talk. She glanced around the alley, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on a rusted metal pipe leaning against the wall, just a few feet away. If things went south, she'd be ready. The newcomer took another step, his smirk fading as his expression hardened. "Last chance," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The man in black finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You're making a mistake!" The newcomer laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We'll see about that." In a flash, the man in black moved. He lunged at the newcomer, his movements swift and precise. The two men collided, their bodies slamming into the brick wall with a sickening thud. Claire's breath caught as she watched the fight unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. The newcomer was strong, but the man in black was faster. He dodged a punch and countered with a sharp elbow to the ribs, forcing the newcomer to stagger back. But the newcomer recovered quickly, his movements fueled by rage. He swung again, his fist grazing the man in black's jaw. Claire's instincts kicked in. She couldn't just stand there and watch. She darted toward the metal pipe, her fingers closing around the cold, rough surface. As she turned back to the fight, she saw the newcomer pull something from his coat. A knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. "Look out!" Claire shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The man in black reacted instantly, sidestepping the blade as it slashed through the air. But the newcomer was relentless, pressing the attack with a ferocity that made Claire's blood run cold. Claire tightened her grip on the pipe and stepped forward. She wasn't going to let this end badly. Not for her. Not for the man in black. She swung the pipe with all her strength, the metal connecting with the newcomer's shoulder with a satisfying thud. He cried out, stumbling back as the knife clattered. To the ground. The man in black didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed the newcomer by the collar and slammed him into the wall, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell your boss this isn't over." The newcomer glared at him, his breath ragged. "You're dead, both of you." The man in black released, him with a shove, and the newcomer stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. He shot one last venomous look at Claire before turning and disappearing into the shadows. For a moment, the alley was silent. Claire's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, the pipe still clutched in her hands. The man in black turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Claire met his gaze, her jaw set. "I'm not just going to stand by and let someone else fight my battles." The man in black studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're braver than I thought." Claire didn't respond. Her mind was already racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. The newcomer's words echoed in her mind. "You're dead. Both of you." She looked at the man in black, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Who was that? And what does he want with me?" The man in black hesitated, then sighed. "It's complicated, but one thing's clear. You're not safe. Not here. Not anywhere." Claire's grip tightened on the pipe. Then, "Tell me what's going on. No more secrets, no more half-truths." The man in black nodded, his expression grim. "Fine, but not here. We need to move." Claire didn't argue. She followed him out of the alley, her mind a whirlwind of questions and fear. Whatever this was, it was far from over. And Claire was ready to face it, head on. The second man, rougher, less restrained, smirked like he had all the time in the world. His confidence wasn't misplaced. He exuded danger in a way the man in black hadn't. His stance was less measured, more predatory. "Well, this is cozy," the newcomer said, his tone mocking. "You really should have made this easier on yourself, kid. Now we have to do this the hard way." "I won't let you touch her," the man in black snapped, his voice steely. Claire's eyes darted between the two men, trying to piece together what was happening. Why is he defending me? Who is this new guy? The realization hit her like a cold splash of water. The man in black hadn't been lying. He wasn't the threat. He'd been trying to protect her all along. The second man tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Oh, you think you can stop me? That's cute. You've always been too soft for this work. Try me," the man in black growled, shifting slightly to block Claire even more. That was when Claire decided she'd had enough. She didn't know who these men were or why they were after her, but she wasn't about to stand by and let them decide her fate. "No one's doing anything," she said loudly, stepping out from behind the man in black. "Not until someone tells me what the hell is going on." Both men froze at her sudden movement, their eyes snapping to her. The second man raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering across his face. "Feisty, huh? I like that." "Claire, stay back," the man in black warned, his voice sharp. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to me," Claire shot back, her frustration boiling over. "You've been following me all day. He's here now, and neither of you is saying anything that makes sense. Start talking, or I'll call the police." The second man chuckled darkly. "Oh, sweetheart, the police won't help you. They don't even know what's going on." "Shut up!" the man in black snapped, his tone colder than Claire had heard before. "You're making this worse." The newcomer shrugged. "She's got a right to know, doesn't she? After all, she's the one holding the prize." Claire's brow furrowed. "What prize? I don't have anything." "Not yet," the second man said, his smirk widening. "But you will. And when you do, it'll be worth more than you can imagine. Too bad you'll never live long enough to use it." Claire's stomach twisted at his words, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Don't let him see you're afraid. They're trying to rattle you." "You've said enough," the man in black said, his voice laced with barely contained fury. "Leave now." The second man's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He didn't seem afraid of the man in black, but there was a tension in his posture, a hint of caution. "Fine," he said after a moment, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'll go, for now. But don't get too comfortable, kid. I'll be seeing you soon." With that, he turned and walked out of the alley, disappearing around the corner as quickly as he had arrived. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stared after him, her heart pounding, her mind racing with questions. What had just happened? What was he talking about? And why did it feel like her entire world was on the verge of collapsing? You shouldn't have stepped out like that, the man in black said, breaking the silence. His tone was softer now, but there was an edge to it, a mix of frustration and concern. Claire turned to face him, her eyes blazing. And you shouldn't have been so cryptic. Who was that guy? What does he want from me? And what's this prize he's talking about? The man in black hesitated, his jaw tightening. His name is Victor. He's a problem. And the prize he's talking about is something your father left behind. Something dangerous. Claire's breath hitched. My father? What does he have to do with this? The man in black sighed, running a hand through his hair. Your father was involved in something big. He found out things he wasn't supposed to know. And when he tried to expose it, they came after him. Claire's mind raced. Who's they? And what did my father find out? The man in black glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure Victor was really gone. It's called Project Blacklight. It's a program designed to track and control people they consider threats. Your father discovered the truth about it, and he tried to stop them, but they found him first. Claire's stomach churned. And now they think I have whatever he left behind? The man in black nodded. Yes. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it. Claire's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. What is it? What did he leave behind? The key? Man in black hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and handed it to her. Claire unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a map, a detailed layout of the city with a single location circled in red. This is where your father hid it, the man in black said. But you need to be careful. If they find out you have this, they'll come for you. And they won't stop until they get what they want. Claire stared at the map, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She didn't know what she was walking into, but one thing was certain. She was done being in the dark. Whatever this was, she was going to see it through, no matter the cost. The man in black, Ethan, paused, his expression hardening as he considered Claire's question. What your father took, it's not just a thing, it's information. Dangerous information. The kind that could bring down some very powerful people. Claire's heart pounded as she tried to process his words. What kind of information? Ethan glanced around, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. It's complicated, but let's just say it exposes things they don't want the world to know. Things about Project Blacklight. Claire's brow furrowed. Project Blacklight? What is that? Ethan hesitated, then sighed. It's a program designed to track and control people they consider threats. Your father found out the truth about it, and when he tried to expose it, they came after him. Claire's stomach churned. And now they think I have whatever he left behind. Ethan nodded. Yes, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it. Claire's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. What is it? What did he leave behind? Ethan hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and handed it to her. Claire unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a map, a detailed layout of the city, with a single location circled in red. This is where your father hid it, Ethan said. But you need to be careful. If they find out you have this, they'll come for you, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Claire stared at the map, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She didn't know what she was walking into, but one thing was certain. She was done being in the dark. Whatever this was, she was going to see it through, no matter the cost. Claire's voice trembled with both curiosity and fear as she asked, "What did he take?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes scanning the street around them. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "They don't tell field agents everything. All I know is that whatever it is, it's tied to you now. That's why you're their target." Claire stopped walking, her fists clenching at her sides. "That doesn't make sense. My dad hasn't done anything remotely dangerous in years. He's a systems analyst, for crying out loud. Ethan turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. Claire, I get it. You don't want to believe this, but these people, they don't make mistakes. If they're after you, it's because they think you're the key to getting what they want, whether you know it or not. Her mind raced as memories of her dad surfaced. His insistence on teaching her how to stay alert, how to read people, how to disappear in plain sight. At the time, she thought he was just being overprotective, a dad worried about his only child. Now those lessons took on a new meaning. Why didn't he warn me? Claire muttered, more to herself than Ethan. If he knew this could happen, maybe he didn't think it would, Ethan said. Or maybe he thought he could protect you from it. Yeah, that's working out great, Claire muttered bitterly. Before Ethan could respond, Claire's phone vibrated in her pocket. She froze, remembering how the device had glitched after Ethan disabled it earlier. Pulling it out, she saw a new notification flash across the screen. It wasn't a text, email, or call. It was a GPS pin marked with a single word. Run. Her blood turned to ice. What is it? Ethan asked, his voice sharp as he noticed the colour drain from her face. She handed him the phone without speaking. He frowned as he read the notification, his jaw tightening. They found us. Who? Claire whispered. Someone tracking you, and me. Ethan pocketed her phone and grabbed her wrist. We need to move, now. He pulled her into a side street, weaving between parked cars and alleyways with practiced ease. Claire struggled to keep up, her heart pounding in her chest. Every sound, every car engine, every distant voice felt like it was coming for them. Panic clawed at her, but she forced herself to focus on Ethan's movements. They ducked into an underground parking garage, the air cool and damp. Ethan guided her behind a row of cars, crouching low as he scanned the area. Stay down, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Claire's breath came in short, shallow gasps. Who's after us? Victor? Or someone else? Both, Ethan said grimly. And they're not alone. Before Claire could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the garage. Ethan's hand tightened on her arm, his body tense. Don't move, he murmured. Claire's heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder. She could see shadows moving across the concrete walls, hear the low murmur of voices. They were close, too close. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a small device. He pressed a button, and the garage's lights flickered before going out completely, plunging them into darkness. Claire's breath caught as she heard the voices grow louder, more urgent. What did you do? She whispered. Bought us some time, Ethan replied. Stay close. He moved quickly, pulling her deeper into the garage. Claire followed blindly, her hand gripping his arm as they navigated the pitch-black space. The voices behind them grew fainter, but Claire knew they weren't safe yet. Finally, Ethan stopped near a service door. He pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase. Up here, he said, guiding her inside. They climbed the stairs in silence, Claire's mind racing. She didn't know where they were going or who was after them, but one thing was certain. She was in way over her head. At the top of the stairs, Ethan pushed open another door, revealing a dimly lit hallway. He led her to a small, unmarked room and locked the door behind them. We'll be safe here for now, he said, his voice low. Claire sank onto a nearby chair, her legs trembling. What now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan crouched in front of her, his expression serious. Now, we figure out what your father left behind, and we make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Claire nodded, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She didn't know what she was walking into, but one thing was certain. She was done running. Whatever this was, she was going to see it through, no matter the cost. Claire crouched, low behind the row of cars, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan's voice was barely audible as he whispered, Stay here. What? No! Claire hissed, her grip tightening on his arm. You can't just leave me. Stay, he repeated, his tone firm. If they're after me too, I can lead them away. You'll be safe here. Claire's jaw tightened. We're in this together now, remember? I'm not just going to sit here while you play hero. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Claire thought he might argue. But then he sighed and nodded. Fine. Stay close. And do exactly as I say. The sound of footsteps echoed through the garage, drawing closer. Ethan motioned for Claire to stay low as he peeked around the corner of a car. Two figures entered the garage, their movements purposeful. They were dressed in dark clothes, similar to Ethan, but their posture was far less restrained. These weren't protectors. They were hunters. Stay quiet, Ethan whispered, slipping a sleek black device from his pocket. Claire recognized it as the same gadget he'd used to disable her phone earlier. This time, he pointed it toward the figures, pressing a button. The lights in the garage flickered, then went out entirely, plunging them into darkness. What the? One of the men growled, his voice cutting through the silence. Who killed the lights? Ethan moved swiftly, grabbing Claire's hand and guiding her through the maze of cars. Claire's heart raced as they navigated the darkness, the sound of the hunters' frustrated voices echoing behind them. They're here somewhere, one of the men barked. Find them! Ethan led Claire to a maintenance door at the far end of the garage. He pulled a small tool from his pocket, fiddling with the lock. The seconds felt like hours as Claire kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see one of the hunters appear at any moment. Finally, the lock clicked open and Ethan pushed the door inward. Go, he whispered, motioning for Claire to step through. They emerged into another alley, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the garage. Ethan didn't stop moving, his grip on Claire's hand firm as he led her down the alley and into the crowded streets beyond. Claire's chest heaved as they blended into the throng of people. Who are they? She gasped. Professionals, Ethan said grimly. They weren't here by chance. Someone sent them. And you think they'll just give up? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head. No. But now we know they're serious. Claire's stomach churned. What does that mean for me? Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. It means we don't have much time. We need to find your father before they do. The words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. Her father, who she thought she knew, who she thought was safe, was now at the center of a dangerous game she barely understood. But one thing was clear. She couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. Where do we start? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Ethan pulled out the map he'd given her earlier, the one with the red circle marking a location. Here, he said, pointing to the spot. This is where your father hid whatever they're after. If we can get there first, we might have a chance. Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. Then let's go. They moved quickly through the streets, Ethan leading the way with practiced ease. Claire stayed close, her eyes darting around as she tried to stay alert. The city felt different now. Every passerby a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place for danger. As they approached the location marked on the map, Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The building was old and unassuming, its windows dark and its facade crumbling. But Claire knew better than to judge by appearances. Whatever her father had hidden here, it was important enough to risk everything for. Ethan stopped at the entrance, his hand resting on the door. Stay behind me, he said, his voice low, and be ready for anything. Claire nodded, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Ethan pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The air was cool and damp, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. The room was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but Claire's eyes were drawn to a small, locked cabinet in the corner. That's it, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's where he hid it. Claire's heart raced as they approached the cabinet. Ethan pulled out his lock-picking tools and went to work, his movements quick and precise. The lock clicked open, and he pulled the door open, revealing a small metal box inside. Claire reached for it, her hands trembling. "What's inside?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's the key to all of this." Claire took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside was a single USB drive and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words written in her father's familiar handwriting. "If you're reading this, Claire, it means I'm not there to protect you. Trust no one. The key is everything." Claire's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't know what was on the USB drive, but she knew one thing. Her father had left it for her, and whatever it was worth fighting for. Claire's heart pounded as Ethan pulled her deeper into the abandoned factory. The shadows seemed to close in around them, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of rust. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, growing louder with each passing second. "They're here," Ethan whispered, his grip on her hand tightening. "Stay close." Claire nodded, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She didn't know who they were, but the urgency in Ethan's voice told her everything she needed to know. These weren't just ordinary pursuers, they were dangerous, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Ethan led her through the maze of rusted machinery and crumbling walls, his movements quick and precise. Claire struggled to keep up, her legs burning with the effort. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see their pursuers emerge from the shadows at any moment. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Somewhere. Safe?" Ethan replied, his tone clipped. "For now." Claire wanted to press him for more answers, but the sound of voices behind them cut her off. She froze, her heart skipping a beat as she heard one of the men shout, "They're in here! Spread out!" Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, and he pulled her into a narrow alcove behind a stack of crates. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't move!" Claire crouched low, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the footsteps growing closer, the voices of their pursuers sharp and urgent. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything Ethan had told her. Her father, a spy, a rogue organization. It all sounded like something out of a movie, not her life. But the fear in Ethan's eyes, the urgency in his voice, it was all too real. And now, she was caught in the middle of it. The footsteps grew louder, and Claire held her breath, her body tense. She could see the shadows of their pursuers moving across the floor, hear the low murmur of their voices as they searched the factory. Her heart pounded in her ears, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, a voice cut through the silence. "Check over there." Claire's breath caught as she saw one of the men step into view. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a black mask. He moved with a predatory grace, his eyes scanning the area as he approached their hiding spot. Claire's mind raced. If he found them, they were done for. She glanced at Ethan, her eyes wide with fear. He met her gaze, his expression grim. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, cylindrical device. "When I say go, run," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Claire nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan pressed a button on the device, and a loud, piercing alarm filled the air. The man in the mask froze, his head snapping toward the sound. "Now!" Ethan hissed, grabbing Claire's hand and pulling her to her feet. They burst out of the alcove, sprinting through the factory as the alarm continued to blare. Claire's legs burned with the effort, but she forced herself to keep moving, her hand gripping Ethan's tightly. Behind them, she could hear the shouts of their pursuers as they scrambled to follow. Ethan led her through a maze of machinery and debris, his movements quick and precise. Claire struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, they reached a small door at the far end of the factory. Ethan shoved it open, pulling Claire through and slamming it shut behind them. They emerged into a narrow alley, the cool night air hitting Claire's face like a slap. She leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Ethan was already moving, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll be on us soon." Claire nodded, pushing herself away from the wall. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to keep moving. Ethan led her through the alley, his grip on her hand firm as they navigated the maze of streets. As they walked, Claire's mind raced. She didn't know who these people were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: she couldn't keep running. If they were going to survive she needed answers. "And fast, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "What now?" Ethan glanced at her, his expression grim. "Now, we find your father. And we end this." Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever it took, she was going to see this through. No more running, no more hiding. It was time to face the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. Claire's heart pounded as she ran through the maze of machinery and crumbling walls, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind her. Ethan's voice echoed in her mind. "We need to split up." She didn't want to leave him, but she knew he was right. If they were going to survive this, they had to take risks. She reached the far wall of the factory, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The exit was just ahead, a sliver of sunlight breaking through the darkness. Relief flooded her as she reached for the door, but a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Well, well," a man drawled. "Look who we have here." Claire spun around, her heart skipping a beat as she saw a figure step out of the shadows. He was tall and imposing, dressed in the same dark tactical gear as the others, but his face was unmistakably familiar. "Dad," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father stepped closer, his expression a mix of relief and guilt. "Claire, I didn't want you to get dragged into this." She felt a surge of anger and confusion. "Then why didn't you tell me what was happening?" "I thought I could handle it," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I could keep you out of it. But Sable is relentless. They don't stop until they get what they want." Claire's chest tightened. "What do they want?" Her father hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek device. It's the evidence I gathered on Sable. Everything they've done, everyone they've blackmailed, it's all here. Then why not give it to someone?" "Who can stop them?" Claire demanded. "I tried," he said. "But Sable has people everywhere. Politicians, law enforcement, intelligence agencies. I couldn't trust anyone until now." Claire's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Her father stepped closer, placing the device in her hands. "You're the only one who can finish this, Claire. You're smart, resourceful, and you're not on the radar the way I was. You can get this to someone who will do the right thing." Before she could respond, the sound of a struggle reached them. Ethan stumbled into view, a cut on his forehead but still standing. Behind him, 2 Sable operatives closed in. "Run!" Ethan shouted. Claire's father grabbed her arm. "Go, I'll hold them off." "No!" Claire cried, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," he said firmly. "You're the only one who can end this." With one final, anguished look, Claire turned and ran, the device clutched tightly in her hand. It felt like both a lifeline and a curse. She didn't stop running until she burst into the sunlight outside, gasping for air. Ethan appeared moments later, his breathing ragged but his resolve unshaken. "Did he—" "He stayed behind," Claire said, her voice breaking. "To protect me." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grim but determined. "Then we make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Together, they disappeared into the city, ready to take the fight to Sable and ensure the truth saw the light of day. For Claire, this was no longer just about survival. It was about justice and finishing what her father had